talked to him a little bit earlier today.
Okay. Well, we'll give him a few more minutes then.
Hey guys.
I am recording, and if you give Kathy a second, she will start to stream. Yep,
Okay.
we're streaming.
All right. Take it away, George.
Okay, so this is the Durham Conservation Committee meeting, and I'm presenting some information, George Tavares, Town Planner, and I am presenting some research that I've been doing on implementation of the 2018 Comprehensive Plan that was adopted by the voters at town meeting. I notice, I think Jess and Kit, I haven't met you yet, but I don't think you were in attendance at last week's workshop. So I was planning to give a quick summary of what we discussed last time. And I had sent out the slides and the information to the committee members who were present last time. And so as I just do that quick review of what we looked at, feel free to jump in with any questions. And as we go through the whole presentation, I'm going to try to take it a piece at a time because it's a lot of technical data over quite a few points of interest. So as we go through this, this is really an education as much as it is policy development. And I've been doing a lot of research on this stuff, working with the planning board. And as I explained to everybody who was present last time, the planning board has been caught up in a lot of other issues. And so I've taken this time, they're taking a break from this stuff to try to, bring you folks up to speed and get your input on these important conservation issues. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and confirm with all of you that you see a set of slides that says Durham Resource Protection Analysis. Is that viewable to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this was one of the slides that I presented last week. And in that presentation and discussion, we looked at 4 questions. And this is, again, flowing from the adopted comprehensive plan of Durham. So the first question was, and one of the issues raised in that comprehensive plan was, how does Durham's resource protection compare with state requirements? And so you see a picture of the zoning map that was adopted November 3rd of 2020. And on that, everything in green, there's 2 shades of green, but everything in green on that map of Durham is zoned as resource protection, which pretty much precludes most, if not all, development within those areas. And the question becomes, how did it, after we look at how does it compare to the state, how did it get here? Then this third question is, what does the current comprehensive plan say about it? And then finally, the comprehensive plan recommends refining the resource protection zoning of the town. And what would that look like if we were to pursue it? So what I'm going to do is walk down through just a summary of what we discussed last time as a reminder and for the newcomers. So we looked first at the comparison between the state requirements for resource protection under the Mandatory Shoreland Zoning Act and what Durham's zoning requires to be resource protection. So as we saw last time, everything within this map, either colored in yellow or colored in red, is required to be shoreland zoning under state law. Now, of that, only the parts in red, the floodplain and steep slopes along the Androscoggin River, the wetlands, in forested wetlands surrounding Runaround Pond, and of some areas of these large, what they call emergent wetlands, there are about 6 in the town that have been identified. Some borders of those also have to be resource protection under state law. But as you can see, comparing the red here and the green on this map, Durham's is far more restrictive than the state requires. So the question then becomes, how did it get there? And so I did some research, found the primary impetus for this zoning was the 2002 comprehensive plan. And just going back to those times, you might recall the late 1900s, 1990s, early 2000, right up until the Great Recession of 2008. 2000 to 2006 in southern Maine was a tremendous time of growth and development. All the towns were adopting growth caps. And so part of the reaction of Durham, like so many communities, was to really look hard at zoning and limiting growth. So in that comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2002 at town meeting, there were 3 criteria for determining what was going to be put into resource protection. And the first of those was the floodplains, not just along the river, but also around Runaround Pond and all of the stream systems within the town. Second major criterion was wetlands. And the town at that time identified 10-acre or larger wetlands, which is kind of a recognized threshold for dealing with wetlands on a different level. But both, unlike the state really focuses the policies on emergent wetlands. Durham also included within that category forested wetlands, which typically have preponderance of trees that are at least 18 feet or taller. And then the third criterion was to put everything.
Question
subject,
there.
Yep. Go ahead.
That 18 feet or taller definition, what's that from? Because that doesn't match Army Corps of Engineers standards for definition of wetlands.
Well, it's actually 6 meters, which I.
Right. Yeah, but where's the number? Where's the number? Did that number come from? Because Army Corps Engineering recognizes anything with a diameter at breast height greater than 3 inches, regardless of tree height.
Well, it's in the DEP regulations.
Okay, so yeah, I was just wondering if you were pulling that from the DEP regs or from Army Corps regs.
DEP.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So that's the second category, and that's reflected in the current zoning map. And then the third area was, again, all shoreland areas, not just those required by state to be resource protection. The town at that time said, if it has to have shoreland zoning, we're going to zone it all resource protection. So then the question becomes, what does the current comprehensive plan recommend? And the current comprehensive plan went through a public participation process between 2016 and 2018. And what came out of that process was a set of recommendations, of which the key ones are shown on this slide from the comprehensive plan. But I'll just summarize it in red down here, where it says the plan calls for refining Durham's regulations to better reflect updated data on natural resources and be more consistent with state laws on natural resources. And so with respect to the floodplains, I did an overlay, and in the gray, if you can see my arrow cursor there, that's the floodplain map from the 2002 plan. And the red overlay is the most recent FEMA floodplain mapping. And what happens is these floodplain areas all shrink down dramatically to what is shown along these water corridors. And I'll show you a more detailed map, but just to give you a sense, the floodplain mapping in 2002 was far more extensive. And that's the biggest part of the resource protection zoning that the town has, the basis for it. Also, the comprehensive plan includes a more recent wetland inventory map. This one shows, based on the National Wetland Inventory, the wetlands, both forested and non-forested, that are 10 acres or more in size. And then the third area of natural resource data available that's referenced in the comprehensive plan is the beginning with habitat analyses for the town of Durham. And Durham's comprehensive plan includes a strategy to use beginning with habitat maps to identify areas with a co-occurrence value of 6 or greater and consider resource protection, zoning, or mandatory clustering to preserve as much of those natural resource values to the maximum extent possible. And this color coding, virtually the greener it is, the more valuable it is from a natural resource standpoint.
Hey, George.
Yes.
Hey, quick question back to the floodplain.
Yep.
When is when's the latest data that we could pull for FEMA? For
The
flood,
date of the most recent flood mapping?
the red, yeah, what's the red?
Yeah. You know, I don't know if it's referenced in the 2018 comprehensive plan. So I would say probably around 2016, maybe right around that time period.
Okay, and then the gray was a previous,
Yeah, that goes back to before 2002.
okay. So, yeah, I'm just, this is a talking point that we can discuss later, but you know, floodplains change. I mean, so the question is, do we, because where these areas are gray, it's not to say it's not going to grow that way, right? But if the data's not there now, it's just a
Well,
thought, you know, loud.
Yeah, they do change. I did some work in Montana, and out there, they have what they call channel migration,
Yeah.
where the rivers coming down move all the time. Here, it's been more an issue of more and more accurate analysis and mapping.
Okay.
That's quote changed the floodplains. And then also along the coast, you get the sea rise that has affected the flood zones. But I don't think within Durham's watersheds there has been or is likely to be that much change. Taking out the dam, as happened on the Presumpscot River here in Falmouth, taking out the dam at Lisbon would make a big difference, and those floodplains would be reduced.
Yeah, it's just interesting how much it has changed from if the gray is 2002.
Yeah, I think it's more a function of more accurate flood mapping.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, so I mentioned the 10-acre plus wetlands based on the 2018 inventory. And a lot of what we're going to get into tonight is related to that. And then the beginning with habitats, the darker the green, the higher the value. In putting this plan together, the town settled on 6+ convergence of 6 or more natural resource values would be something to consider for resource protection or mandatory clustering. So then the question is, what would a refinement of this map look like if you moved in the direction recommended by the comprehensive plan? And in last week, I presented kind of just conceptually what would happen is in the same way that the aquifer protection districts were revised. The state did these sand and gravel aquifer maps. Again, just like the flood, they get better analysis, more detailed information. And so what they determined was that in 2011, more accurate sand and gravel aquifer mapping was done. And the red was the preceding maps were based on, and the blue was the 2011. And so the aquifer protection districts of Durham were not well aligned with the actual aquifers in Durham. And so in the last round of updates of the land use ordinance and zoning map, the map was actually revised to take these red areas out of the aquifer protection district and put these blue areas into it to make sure that they were in alignment. And so with the resource protection, that would kind of be the same process. And I've actually conceptually described it as realigning the resource protection zoning of the town. And so this is just an early, and this is a work in progress, but working with the mapping people at the Greater Portland Council of Governments, I was able to get them to produce a very early draft version of what applying the criteria that I presented last week, and we're going to explore in detail this week. So on the left, you see the current resource protection zoning. And then on the right would be what a refinement might look like. So I presented these 8 criteria last week, and I'm going to add one in response to the input that I got from you folks last week. So the first criterion draft for moving forward with the refinement could be the 100-year floodplains shown on the most recent FEMA flood maps. Secondly, all areas subject to mandatory shoreline zoning. And on each of these, I'll kind of walk you through and give you some policy options to consider. Thirdly, land within 75 feet of a perennial stream. Fourth, land within a forested wetland, 10 acres or more, just like in the 2002 comprehensive plan, along with all contiguous wetlands. And I'll get into explaining why that phrase was added and why it's important. Fifth, land with an emergent wetland of 10 acres or more. And I presented this phrase last time, but as I was doing some additional analysis, I'm going to show you why I think we may want to not apply that to the emergent wetlands. Then land within 75 feet of emergent wetlands of 10 acres or more, unless those emergent wetlands have been rated as moderate or high value for wading bird and waterfowl habitat. And then last time I did present to you, land rated by beginning with habitat as having 6+ multiple natural resource values. But I put in the qualifier last time that some of you struggled with, those areas currently zoned as resource protection. So you asked that we take a second look at that idea. And so I've added a 9th possible criterion to look at those areas that are not currently zoned as resource protection, but have that same importance assigned to it by beginning with habitat. So we'll look at that tonight. Okay, so what I'm going to do is walk you through each of these 9 criteria and stop on each one and give opportunity for discussion and hopefully some feedback and possible direction on where to go with these. Everybody game?
Yeah, and George, in general, these 9, you say draft, right?
Yes.
These are a very, what's the word, developed draft, I should say. Is that a good term for these 9? You've done a lot of thinking and, there's a lot of good background for these 9, right? But it is draft, I guess.
Well, I prefer to think it's developed as opposed to undeveloped, but yes, there.
Yes, okay.
A lot of thought has gone into it, I will say that, and it's based on looking at the data and looking at the comprehensive plan.
Yep. Got it.
But as we go forward, these are all, there's no hard fast, this is the way it has to be. As I shared in that first, the state has not said you have to do much of this. This goes beyond the state law, so there's a lot of room for calibration up or down within this. Okay? So let's take a look at the 100-year floodplain. We've already discussed it a bit. So I think this one's probably the simplest. It's really just an issue of getting to the most recent, but there is a policy question. And at least since 2002, the town has adopted a policy that there can be no development within the floodplain. And many communities have floodplain. They allow development. It just has to be flood mitigated, so that if you build houses, they have to be not sustain significant damage. They have to engineer it with like breakaway walls and those sorts of things to keep the building from being flooded down the river. But many communities allow continued development in the floodplain subject to the flood standards of the federal government. And there is a flood management ordinance in effect for the town of Durham. But that will only apply right now to alterations to existing developed areas within, of which there are very few. You maybe have a dozen at most flood located properties that actually have buildings on them. The rest is all undeveloped. So I'm assuming that the town, it's a good policy to have to not allow the development in the floodplain, even if you try to flood proof it. It's typically designed to withstand a 100-year flood, but I'm sure the Androscoggin River, like the Presumpscot River, has had major floods that far exceed the 100-year flood level.
Do you know when Durham had its most recent 100-year flood?
I don't.
It used to get bad enough it would shut down 136.
Really?
Yeah, someone who lives
Oh, yeah.
here longer than me
close-
told me that
Yeah,
it
it
wasn't
closed the
that-
road down.
that it got shut down.
They have to, what do they close the schools or, kids can't get across.
Well, I don't ever remember them closing the schools, but they'd come down Bowie Hill. So I always knew
Oh.
it was closed when all of a sudden my
Oh.
road became a super highway.
Right, okay, all right.
But yeah, so it hasn't flooded since they put in the embankments and took the land to move the road over. But I don't see why it wouldn't again. But it definitely would be a much larger flood than what used to flood the road.
Can you hover over 136 on the map?
Yeah, so yep, right up in there, exactly, right along the river. And that's
Okay.
right where that floodplain is, right where they would go, where it would shut down. Because
Okay.
you would come up Stackpole, which is a little, yep, right there. Yep. And then you would come down Bowie and then go back out by the Get and Go.
Hmm.
So I think it makes sense to just continue with saying no development within the 100-year floodplain, but just updating the map to show the most accurate info. Because I think George is right. You know, the mapping info is the level of detail that they can get with things like LiDAR and all kinds of stuff is just much better now. And FEMA, right, you know, pays attention to these things. So if we just say the 100-year floodplain, it just means that, as you know, as mapped by FEMA, just means as that changes, our map changes with it, you know.
I
But
just
is
wanted
that,
to-
can we, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I wonder if there's any modeling that can be done to predict effects of climate change on floodplain areas where we are probably expecting more, you know, severe storms and greater frequency. I just wanted to throw out the idea of climate change potentially influencing these areas 10 or 20 years, you know, down the road.
And then my concern was around tying the law to not an ever-changing map, but a map that will change and then can cause, I don't know if it'll cause confusion with development, or, you know, people would come back and maybe try again. I don't know if it's possible to tie the rule to the specific one that we're looking at now, and then maybe in the future it can be relooked at.
Okay, so let me bring in some legal principles here.
Yeah, thank you.
And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with lawyers on land use issues for 40 years now, and have followed, like I go to conferences and follow the legal presentations on Supreme Court decisions on land use issues. So a couple of principles that apply here are having science-based regulations, as opposed to, and you can have non-science-based, you can have aesthetic regulations. However, there really has to be good data behind whatever you're doing, and a rationale and a public process to get there. Typically on something like floodplains, it's a fairly precise science, and those maps are updated periodically, and the maps do change. The flood situation can change, as Jess was pointing out, with climate change and other factors. Like I said, the biggest change that would affect this would be the removal of that dam. That dam at Lisbon backs up the water up the river, and a lot of this right here, if that dam were removed, this would dramatically be changed in terms of flooding. So yes, the situations can change. However, the other legal principle I would bring in is that there is this concept that has been recognized by the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court of what they call investment-based expectations. And what that principle says is, if someone purchased a piece of land based on your comprehensive plan, based on your regulations that when it went into effect, it's not that it can't change, but they have a higher stake in something. If they bought the land and it's all floodplain and it stays floodplain, their case against the town's ordinances are, you know, you're far more restrictive with resource protection than with just floodplain management. So this idea, I just want to plant in your minds this concept, legal concept of investment-based expectations. so that if someone bought a piece of land, it's always been resource protection, or at least it was for a long, long time, their case against the town is pretty weak. If, on the other hand, you put forward a new restriction that takes away their property rights, and you don't have sound public policy to support it, and they bought it without that in effect, that ramps up their leverage against the town enforcing its ordinances. So just kind of keep those principles as we go forward and have some of this discussion. Because a lot of times it's hard to look at things from all different angles.
Is
You
that why
folks-
most, if you don't mind me jumping in real quick, that must be why a lot of, new regulations that were adopted back in the day with things like shoreline zoning, stuff like that, had exemptions for property that was developed prior to that, right? So if you
Yes,
you can't add an addition to your house necessarily without going through a permitting process or appeals process. But if you maintain same footprint, you can. So, I mean,
and it's also why, if you look at the shoreline zoning guidelines that the DEP has promulgated, I mean, it is so complicated. And the reason is because they're trying to keep it flexible to accommodate people's property rights while trying to accomplish the goals of shoreline zoning to protect water resources and habitat. So there's this dance that goes on, and a lot of times you'll have lawsuits, or you'll have a horrendous development that just rapes the environment. And then there's this push to put in fixes into the law, and it gets more and more complicated as we go. But yes, that is a basis for a lot of exemptions that are put in.
Can I ask for a sort of a definition? My concept of what a 100-year flood map is that it's going for the catastrophic, like this is only going to happen once in 100 years, and when you
No,
think
no.
it's
No,
not, okay,
no.
It's based on a percentage probability of it happening. And within any year, there's only a 1% chance of a 100-year flood level being achieved. But you could have back-to-back years with a 100-year flood.
Right.
And so what happens is the higher the flood year, like a 500 flood year, has even less percent chance of happening. A 20-year, 10-year has, 5%, 10%. So it's that kind of a mathematic abstraction, but the term that's been applied is a 100-year floodplain, but it is a very confusing concept.
okay.
Yeah.
So what you might say is that with climate change, what you expect once, it might happen 3 years in a row,
Yeah,
Well,
or it might get higher even than that.
I think a perfect example is if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, at least as long as I've been paying attention to the news for 10 years now, there's been 300-year hurricanes,
Right,
So the term 100-year is misleading
right.
because that's what you think is, oh, it's a once in a century storm. But with climate change, the percent, it's, it's a 1% chance of happening annually. But with climate change, we're seeing those storms happen at a higher frequency.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a 1% chance any year that this floodplain this map could get filled completely with water, but that could happen 2 years in a row, 3 years in a row,
Right.
All right. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird term.
Okay. So is everybody pretty much on board with just keeping that policy, the status quo, which is all RP, but refining it for those maps?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to it.
Yeah, George, sorry, I am in agreement as well as to keep it in, but wondering about the data. So if this is going to show up in our map, but Joe, you had a good point of just saying, the latest floodplain.
Oh, well, what I was going to say is, look, anytime that FEMA updates maps,
Mhm.
typically towns look at it. And that would be the time at which to make a revision. Just simply go to town meeting, say FEMA has updated its, like, for example, if the dam got removed, then the town would say this floodplain is nowhere near as expansive as it was, and that would be the basis on which to revise the map.
Okay. And if someone comes to us with a permit, the town with a permit application, they would need to show, if they were near a floodplain, they would need to show the data based on, FEMA. So,
Yep.
George, correct me if I'm wrong, it works both ways there with the investment-backed expectations. If someone buys a chunk of property in floodplain and they get a great price because everyone thinks you can't use it, and then a dam is removed, and now that's no longer mapped floodplain, they are gaining the potential on that property too, correct?
Gaining is not a problem.
Well, no, I'm not saying it's a problem. Well, I understand what you're saying is that, if the FEMA map updates because of, for some reason, now someone's front yard is floodplain, it's like, and then you get into the case by case basis. So.
Yeah, but again, as the courts, the typical court case is somebody challenging the restrictions being placed on their land by the town.
Mhm.
So if the town has a restriction on there and it's no longer needed, the town should, from a policy standpoint, get rid of it. But you always
George,
look
can I
at it
just
from
ask
the
quickly,
court
you've
side.
mentioned several times now taking that dam out. Is there discussion about removing the Lisbon Dam, or is that just, you're just making
No,
an example?
There's discussion on all main rivers of dam removal. It's
Okay.
happened on the Kennebec, it's happened on the Presumpscot. So it's a trend to try to get the fishways opened up.
Mhm.
And I don't know what the purpose of that mill is, what it's used for, but
It's electricity.
yeah. And I don't know how old it is, it's probably pretty old. So anyway, those are always corporate decisions at way high places. But yeah, there's moves to get them all out at some point.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, especially when they get damaged by floods. That's when the companies say it's not worth fixing it. And with all the solar coming in, that's got to have an impact too, so. Okay, let's go on to all areas subject to mandatory shoreline zoning. Again, the current policy down here in parentheses on the right is all RP. And that could be the continuation of the town's policy, but the town could also consider adopting the same shoreline zoning program that the state allows, which would have some resource protection as shown on that first map. You could have, the town currently has some limited residential around those large open wetlands. There's concern with home-based businesses to allow as an alternative to limited residential, which does not allow commercial, to have limited commercial or stream protection. So again, assuming the less policy change, the better in this process. Keeping it all as resource protection would seem to me to be a first option to consider. And then a second option to consider would be getting away from total resource protection to allow some limited development in these areas. And there could be some other approach too.
There's not a lot of space that does not overlap with the floodplain. I think it looks like there might be a little, but it would seem to make sense to do, all resource protection because it's going to be it's going to be protected anyways due to floodplain.
Yeah, that issue of the overlying of different resource values is an important one. Okay, I'm going to move on, assuming that there's no compelling reason to go in a different direction, such as B. Okay, the third criterion is land within 75 feet of a stream. And just walking you around the town, over here on the border with Brunswick, you've got Pinkham Brook, and then you've got Meadowbrook, and then Newell Brook, which goes all the way up to here. And then you've got Dyer Brook, which goes up past the elementary school. And then Garish Brook goes through that floodplain and up. This is an unnamed stream. And then you've got Libby Brook that flows down into Runaround Pond. Runaround Pond Brook comes in at this point. I think that's Pownell over there. And then Runaround Brook flows out and down becomes the Chandler. And then Alderbrook feeds down into that. And then finally, you've got the east branch of the Chandler, and both Chandler branches flow to the Royal River eventually. So those are the brooks that are named within the town. And there were 3 policy options for this part of the equation. The first is the width of the buffer. The second is the type of buffer. And the third is which class of streams do you apply those to? So with respect to the width of the buffer, DEP across all of their programs, Shoreland Zoning, Natural Resource Protection Act, has moved to a consistent 75-foot width. You used to have some 100, some 75, some 25, but they've just to get some reduced complexity, they've pretty much gone with a consistent standard of 75 feet. Durham, like many communities going back to the 1980s, has a 100-foot width along the streams. And then some communities and conservation groups have argued for much larger buffers for wildlife corridor purposes. So there are at least 3 different options there. And then on the type of the buffer, Durham currently has the resource protection, which is the strictest. Within 100 feet of the stream, you can't do virtually anything. And that is administered by the code officer. You could go to a stream protection under shoreland zoning, which is less strict, but again, administered by the code enforcement officer. The least restrictive protection for streams would be the NRPA rules. And that is administered by the DEP, not by the local code officer. And then the question of which streams, the larger streams are required to be shoreland zoning stream protection by DEP. And just to show you where those are, it's these sections. And basically wherever you have 2 of these 2 perennial streams come together, at that juncture from there down is usually shoreland zoning requirement for stream protection. So you can see that most of the stream and stream segments within the town are not required to be shoreland zoning by DEP. And so that's a question. Durham has elected to put a 100-foot setback on all of these streams, and that's a policy question. So three different factors of the width of the buffer, the type of buffer, and which streams. And based on all of the state programs looking at 75 feet, that would be my recommendation. But that would be a difference from the 100-foot that's currently in place. And that 100-foot town regulation has caused real problems in terms of being in conflict with the state law.
What
Nice.
sort
So
of
George,
problems?
how long has it been 100 feet?
At least back to 2004.
So a long time. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious what sort of problems it's caused.
Well, we have people that look at DEP regulations and, that's everywhere. And they say 75 feet. So you have actually had people build foundations within 84 feet of a stream, thinking it's 100 feet and then, or excuse me, 75 feet per DEP. And then the code officer goes out there and says, town says 100. And so they've got the foundation there and then you're.
Yeah, has that happened a lot?
It's happened at least once since I've been working with the town.
Yeah,
And what happens is then they go to the DEP and they try to tell, and DEP thinks the town's got it wrong. And so you get the state agency, local people going back, playing each other back and forth.
has DEP told the town that the reg is wrong, or has DEP told the potential developer that they should have checked local ordinance first? Because my understanding, because we can make an ordinance that's.
Oh, absolutely,
restrictive, yeah.
absolutely, you can. But my view is the more consistent you are with the state laws, the better it is for everybody. And is there that much benefit from having 100 feet versus 75 feet? And if there is, and you make a compelling case based on scientific data, then the town certainly can go to keep it at 100 feet or go bigger.
Can I, my perspective is, since you mentioned the wildlife corridors, and eventually we want to look at the beginning with habitat, is to begin with the beginning with habitat would be
And
my
beginning with-
preference. And see, it might even like on Newellbrook, I think there was a really good sized beginning with habitat priority zone near some of that. So, you know, if we began with beginning with habitat and see what that looked like, maybe it'd be worth revisiting this after, possibly,
Well, let me
or
just
am I
point-
being simplistic?
well, let me point
No,
out
you know
that
what? I'm sorry.
Beginning with
George.
Habitat does recommend 75 feet along streams.
No, but I think what Roberta might be saying is that
Yeah,
habitat of species, we might see if we look at those BWH maps, that their habitat extends beyond the 75 feet, which
or
would,
the corridors, if you're looking at wildlife corridors, you might have one area that's a priority for beginning with habitat, have another area close by and say, gee, where would the wildlife corridor maybe
Mhm.
possibly go? Possibly, you know, 85 feet, or, you know, that's
Yeah.
very simplistic.
Yes.
but It might possibly be to connect those two areas, might be to go along that stream if it were undeveloped.
right. And so Sam, as our chair,
Yes.
I would recommend for this point is to maybe table this one and we can talk about it maybe at the next call
Come
tonight
back to it. Yeah.
on the rest of it. I think, Roberta, I personally like that idea of looking at the BWH maps, seeing where the habitat is along these, and it's so interesting. Everything's called a brook in Durham. I just noticed that. No rivers, no streams. Anyways, looking at that and just seeing what that looks like as far as feet. And if it makes sense to increase or keep 100 feet, right? Right now it is 100 feet in our ordinance. We would be decreasing that. So kind of talk a little further about that later, if that's okay with you, George and Sam.
Absolutely. And all of this, you know, there's no binding. This is all just continuing policy discussion and development. So.
I mean, I think some of them are going to be easier, kind of like the floodplain we talked about. You know.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
as you see, I'm going through here, I'm giving you the options.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm locked in on 75 feet. The reason I'm saying 75 feet is for a couple of reasons, is that's what the state is suggesting is the at least what you should be doing. And you don't have to do it on all streams. This is, so I'm looking at what are the options and what's kind of the industry standard, if we can use that term.
Yeah, that's another option too, if you don't have to do it in all streams, because I was just wondering if you look
Yeah.
at the beginning with habitat, how often are those priority areas near streams?
Yeah, so,
And what does it look like after that?
yeah, I agree with Juliet that this might be a good convo to have in the future, because I think what you're getting at, Roberta, is that some of these streams are already being captured as 6 or more co-occurrences along the riparian zone for a variety of reasons. So that is something we could discuss. So, because if we end up saying we want to adopt the beginning with habitat 6+ co-occurrences, it might capture those high value corridors along certain riparian zones because of a number of other environmental factors. So yeah, I think that's something good to talk about later for sure.
Yeah, and the floodplain's also going to expand those out.
Right.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to get those 3 policy areas and some options before you. And I understand you want to take a closer look at that before you make any decisions. Okay, so let's move on to the real sticky stuff, which is the wetlands 10 or more acres, along with all contiguous wetlands. So what you've got here is the National Wetlands Inventory for Durham. You can get on their website, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can zoom right in and look at these to your heart's content. I've spent an awful lot of time, a lot of Excedrin moments looking at these maps. And so what you see is generally the 2 classes, and there are a gazillion different variations within these, The two general classes are the freshwater emergent wetlands and the freshwater forested wetlands. So really the terms emergent and forested, we're not dealing with coastal floodplains or wetlands in Durham. So generally the two classes that we need to talk about are the forested and the emergent. And so this lighter green color is emergent and the darker green is the forested. Now, what you'll find is that if you zoom in on these on the National Wetlands Inventory and you click on any one of these that are outlined, and you see a classification system here, and if you click it on, there's a get the specifics, you'll see that this one here, which is off Swamp Road, I think that is, it's a forested. It is needle-leaved evergreen, the number 4. So FO is forested. Number 4 is needle-leaved evergreen. There's a subclass and a split class of shrub. There's probably shrubs and scrubs mixed in with all of that all those trees. There's also a subclass of broadleaf deciduous trees along with the evergreens. And then finally, the B indicates the hydrology of it, and it's seasonally saturated. So each of these wetlands, of which there are a gazillion in Durham, has its own classification. And the problem is this one, if you do a GIS analysis to show you, as we did on that map with all the blue, remember that? The wetlands, 10 or plus acres. This is 20 acres, but right adjacent to it, there's another 9.39 acres of forested wetland with slightly different characterizations. And this does not show on the map because it's 9.39 acres. As I was doing this analysis, trying to figure out how on earth can you do this, you know, this one down here, every one of these pieces that's separated by these drainage channels is a separate wetland category characterization and is listed. So there's probably 10 acres here if this is 9 acres, but there's like 7 different wetlands and none of them account for 10 acres of size and won't show on your mapping if you do a 10-acre analysis. So if you add in this phrase along with all contiguous wetlands, that would incorporate all of this wetland system together. So that's why I came up with adding that phrase to try to get at this. Okay, so now if you look at what was the basis in 2004, they didn't have GIS mapping back then. And when you looked at the wetland map and how extensive it was through the town, what they settled on without doing any field analysis or GIS analysis is they basically said, if a swamp shows on the property maps, then that's going to be resource protection. That's how we will define 10-acre plus wetlands. And you can see that these wetlands that I just showed you that are, this one's 20 acres, they don't register on that map, but this is the basis of the current zoning map. Area swamps as defined on the large scale tax maps is the basis for the current resource protection zoning.
I can see why that doesn't make sense. In other words, if it's on a map, then it should be on a map, on the new map.
Well, the goal is to get the most accurate data you can base it on. And those tax maps are not accurate. So here's where I showed you, if you take the 10-acre, this is that same wetland, couple of wetland systems I just showed you. So you see in the overlay green from the blue, this is the 2018 comprehensive plan 10-acre plus wetland map, critical rural area. You can see on the, it might be hard to see on your screen, but this is a blow up of that right there. And what's shown in blue here is this part right here, the 20 point whatever it was acres. The 9 acres does not show up on this inventory. Similarly, this one right here, you've got this small area that's has a different wetland characterization, less than 10 acres. This one is 10 acres. That looks like kind of like a bull's head with the horns. And then this part down here is 2 separate wetlands, less than 10 acres each. So the only part that shows on the blue map, which is in the comprehensive plan, is these 2 right here, and not the rest of it. But again, these would be captured by this phrase along with all contiguous wetlands. So this entire system here would be part of the resource protection zoning. So here are some policy options.
Question for you on that, George.
Yep.
Language says land within a forested wetland of 10 or more acres along with contiguous wetlands. So obviously NWI maps are pretty coarse and rarely capture all of the wetlands in an area. So does this language carry over to someone who, let's say, wants to develop their property and finds that they have 10 acres or more of a contiguous wetland, or that their wetland, let's say their drainage that extends into the field of the property that they're buying is attached to a 10-acre forested wetland offsite?
Okay, so that brings up a couple of different issues and complexities of what we're trying to do here. And that is this issue of, is that 10 acres within your property, or does it go across properties? If it's on the zoning map, that crosses properties, as you can see here. These are property lines. And so if you did this resource protection, this property within this part would be restricted, and this property within this part would be restricted. This part would not be restricted. So from that standpoint, it doesn't respect property lines. However, if it did not appear on the map, and then the question would be, and it could be shown that there is 10-acre contiguous, then I think that would be a legal question of whether or not that is subject to the resource protection zoning or not.
Yeah, that's just where what I'm wondering is if we're, because this language doesn't say within forested wetlands of 10 acres or more that are currently mapped.
Well, some lawyers would argue if it isn't mapped, it doesn't count. Other lawyers would argue whether it's on the map or not. The map is just a general representation.
Right.
And
Yeah.
when you go out there, you have to do field analysis to prove it one way or the other, if you're going to challenge it.
Yeah, so I guess I bought in Durham, but I didn't build. So I don't know if building process involves you making sure that your building isn't going to be within these resource protected areas, if there's a permitting process where you have to do that. And if so, does that include, a component of bringing in the wetland delineator to look at the property?
Yeah, whenever a property is developed, if it goes through the planning board, whether it's commercial or residential, wetland evaluation is one of the requirements, mapping.
Right.
And so at that point, that's where these issues usually come up. Somebody applies for a subdivision, they got to deduct these areas out.
Yeah, and that's my question, is just what an implication of this has on wetlands that are discovered during that permitting process.
Yeah, what the benefit of the map is typically it tells you out here on this property, you better look quick and you better look close, because that area has been zoned that way. And that's because there's a preponderance of wetlands out there that are at least 10 acres and more. And so you need to be aware of these restrictions. When you go to develop it, it gets ratcheted up even more intense scrutiny.
Hey, George, as we think about our options here,
Yeah.
how much more wetlands would we be adding to our map from 2018 if we did include,
Contiguous.
yeah.
Yeah, well, that's an issue. Okay, but let me just explain the options.
Okay, yeah, do that first. Thanks.
Okay, so these policy options over here are just go with the 10 acre plus based on the National Wetland Inventories, what's on this map right now, which doesn't include all of the 10-acre plus if you do contiguous or combination. You might have 3 or 4 3-acre wetlands all adjacent to each other, but with different characterizations. In combination, they make 10 acres. So that would be the second option. First option is the most conservative. It's just say, look, if it's 10 acres itself, that part of it has to be resource protection. Second option is to say, no, we gotta, if it's 10 acres, it's 10 acres, and whether it's got one characterization or another shouldn't make any difference. And therefore, all of this is going to be the 10-acre wetland as the threshold. There's at least one 10-acre wetland there with a single classification, and any contiguous wetland with that gets lumped into the resource protection. I think that would be a very defensible policy, politically as well as legally. Okay. Then the third option, few towns are doing this, I think, at least in my experience, what you're doing here. Because the Army Corps of Engineers and the DEP both have fairly stringent wetland regulations. And those regulations say each property owner within this wetland is allowed to fill or alter, I think the number is 4,300 square feet. And anything that you can do without any permitting, anything beyond that, you get into permitting, anything for anything up to an acre. And in that permitting process, they look at, is there an alternative to what you're proposing? And if you can prove to them that there's no alternative to what you're proposing to do, then they go to mitigation. How can you minimize the impacts on the wetland that you're going to be doing? Again, this is all between 4,300 square feet and 1 acre total of area. And so they can require you to do all kinds of mitigation to reduce your footprint and minimize the impact that you're going to have on the wetland. And then if you go over an acre, then they get into compensation. And typically you got to find some place that, it used to be 20-to-1 ratio. For every acre of wetland you disturb, you got to preserve 20 or restore 20 acres somewhere else. I don't know what the current formula is, but the DEP and the Army Corps of Engineers strictly regulate development within wetlands. And most towns just simply rely upon that regulation as opposed to establishing it all as resource protection. So if this process of trying to find which of these are technically 10 acres and get into all kinds of very difficult policy discussion, and not having the GIS mapping capability to do this quickly and effectively, one option I think you should seriously consider is just simply letting the Army Corps and DEP regulations control any alteration of these wetlands. Not likely that Durham would do that, but at least I want to put it on the table for consideration.
Why do you think Durham's not likely to do that?
Because it's been resource protection since at least 2002. And the premise is, look, this limits development, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for the town. Investment-based expectations. But part of the problem here is those investment-based expectations were based on really bad data.
So you think it would be seen as lessening our restrictions by going with?
I think some people would see it as lessening, but at the same time, I think it's very hard sledding when you don't have a solid policy basis on this stuff. And without the GIS tools to really do this right, and very little support for public funding to do these types of studies, it's just a very mission impossible. Try to get this and get it right.
So would the process, George, somebody would come and would need to work with the DEP in order to identify the ability to develop a piece of property, and they would get involved? How would that work?
No, from the town policy standpoint, what you would do, this can be done. A typical study of this would be like $20,000, $30,000 to look at in detail all of these wetlands on the National Wetland Inventory and to do some analysis of all of these systems, one at a time. And if you look at, let me go back to that. Okay, so this is Durham. The line's over here somewhere and comes around like this. All of these wetlands, you know, they range from very tiny, but some of these, you know, where's that 10-acre threshold? And again, each one of these little splotches, you need to do analysis. So first you got to identify them, and then you got to analyze them, and then you got to make policy calls on them. You know, I think if you were going to do this and do it right, you'd want to take a look at, you know, this whole wetland system and what is its ecological value. You know, is this high value? And we'll go on and talk in just a minute about some practical inland fisheries and wildlife guidance for what's important and what's not as important. I mean, obviously all wetlands have important functions, but trying to analyze and regulate all of those to come up with a zoning program, if you had the resources, it's tough. If you don't have the resources and the financial backing to do it right, it's really, really bad.
Yeah, and so my 2 cents here is that, you know, keep going back to the fact that we want to base our decisions on science here, right? And so, you know, like you mentioned, George, that one wetland without that 9-acre adjacent wetland part makes no sense at all. That's one system right there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think the science would back that up. So that's my thought, is that, you know, for science's sake, I think we should really consider looking at all of these areas. And actually, I do think that won't be as hard as we think. I think we can talk about hiring like a consultant, a GIS consultant, and really what they would do is they would cut the NWI layer for Durham, and then they would run not a queue, but they would run a analysis and trim everything first, 10 acres and more, and then they would add in anything adjacent to it and they pop out a layer, and it's really quick for them, I think, to do something like that. But so I think we can do it. It's an option that my thought is maybe we table this as well when we talk about this next time. But I'd love to hear what other people think about this.
I have a quick question about, did all of those options exclude like that area you have there that's mostly the light green? Did all of those policy options exclude that because it's less than 10 acres of any one of the categories?
Well, the 2 that would exclude it would be A, just 10-acre plus per the National Wetland
Right,
Inventories. That's already been done by GPCOG, and that's what's on this map, blue, is
Mhm.
A. B would get all of these. That would do require doing the analysis to look at each of these individually and make a call on whether it should be in or should be out. And then the third one, just backing away from zoning all this stuff, resource protection, and just saying, look, it's already got the protection of the Army Corps and the DEP. And if you've ever gone through their process, you know how hard it is. There's really no need for the town to zone this as resource protection. So those are the 3 policy options. The only one that would really vary from this, I mean, those Army Corps and DEP, they apply no matter what you do. So when I say just 10-acre plus, that just says for these, the town is going to impose resource protection. You don't even have to talk to DEP. You can't do it. But every property owner would have to go through DEP and Army Corps beyond what you do.
But what I'm talking about is, if I'm understanding this correctly, on that expanded where you have the arrow there on the bottom,
Oh, this
the
down
bottom
here?
part, yeah.
Yeah.
So the first 2 options would exclude that completely.
No, actually, the B and combined, I'm assuming that this combined is 10 acres.
Okay, because that would put it into the 10 acre when you add
Yeah.
the combined. Okay,
Yeah, I mean, this would be the most robust analysis would be B.
okay, I see.
And
All right.
the two options are not be robust and just say, these are the important ones from the town that we want to make sure nothing happens in these areas. But even within, if you don't do that, the DEP and Army Corps are still going to regulate it. That's C. And just stop trying to regulate these as resource protection. Let the DEP and Army Corps do their business.
Yeah, and it's just difficult when I think about C. You feel like, okay, if they're going to allow a certain amount of filling in, just like as a blanket thing, go ahead. It's less than 1 acre, just do it. You know, from a conservation standpoint, I feel like what's on that area? What lives there?
Yeah,
I mean,
Roberta,
that's the hard part.
another thing to think about is that that limitation doesn't stick with the wetland, it goes by ownership. So if someone buys the property, they can then, the next owner can then fill that in. And then someone else buys the property, the next owner can fill that much percentage in. So it doesn't stick with the wetland, it goes with the owner.
Oh, that's an interesting.
Oh,
Are you
wow.
sure? Are you sure about that?
I mean, that's what my wetland delineation professor told me. But that was in 2014. So unless it's changed.
Can
Yeah, I
someone
would
follow?
want to talk to, I would want to
be a
talk.
straight A student either, so I might have, been snoozing a little bit. during that.
I would be very surprised if that was accurate.
I could check, but
No, I think it goes with the land.
I mean, once it's filled in, so you're saying that if the first owner
yeah.
did
this could be
some
something
filling
we can
in,
do.
then the next time someone
Yeah.
buys it, it's like, nope. You
Yeah,
already
that
did
heard
it for
that,
this.
yeah, that's on record. Yeah. But I'm not a wetland specialist either, so.
Do you guys want to table this one and talk about it?
Yeah, at this point, our table's looking like a Thanksgiving dinner, but
We're not done yet.
Right.
Now for the,
So do you
Now
think
for the-
option B would be met with a lot of resistance, or that's kind of an easy?
well, it's gonna get very sticky, and my concern is you guys, the planning board has, every time it goes to the town meeting to try to get funding, it's pretty bare bones, as Juliet will attest.
Mhm.
And so the idea that you're gonna hire a wetland specialist to come in and evaluate all these wetlands, you can put in for the funding, but if you don't have that funding, it's gonna be hard to do it right now. Let me just say, I mean, you can't do anything until next town meeting now, which is a year from this month. So there's time. I'm gonna work on continuing to develop my GIS capability. There's a free program. ArcGIS is, you gotta pay Esri every time you try to do anything. And it's expensive, but there's a free program called QGIS that I just have been looking into. So, I mean, if you could get some pro bono analysis, that would be great. I've tried with beginning with Habitat. Asked them for some customized maps, which they offer on their website, but when they heard what I was talking about, they said, go talk to GPCog.
Yeah. Hey,
And so
George,
I've tapped out GPCog. I've gotten a lot of mapping done by them.
yeah, George, I really don't think it's going to be an issue either. I don't think the cost would be that expensive, but even if that, I think there's a couple people on the board that, consultants or, know people. And I know one guy that offered even a couple of years ago, back when Paul was here,
Yeah.
that would help with this.
That's good. Yeah. And I'm not
Pro
trying to
bono.
discourage
So-
it. I'm just trying to be realistic about, look,
Yeah.
if you don't have any money to work with, it doesn't matter how expensive it is, you can't afford it.
I think if anything, we should find out what we've got in the town, where these are, and then figure out what to do with them after.
Yeah, I'm gonna continue doing some analysis and developing my capability. And in the meantime, if you can find somebody that can do this real easy and real quick and would do it pro bono, that would be wonderful. But even then, as you go through and start looking at each of these wetlands, like, there's people that live right here,
Right,
and you start talking about
I know.
zoning all of their land around them as
Right.
resource protection, be ready for some political fire.
Oh, yeah. That's what I'm most worried about.
Yeah, so it's all of these layers of difficulty.
Yeah, but again, I go back to the science, right? That's what we're doing here. That's what we're trying to update everything based on science. And
Yeah, but their policy is based on, say, Army Corps is based on science. And they would say, look, Army Corps already regulates this. Why are you doing this to me?
yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep, okay.
We,
so let's
we, yeah,
go-
we have to balance that.
Let's go on. The fifth course for your meal tonight is the emergence, which is the same issue. So here, this is again off, I think this is Swamp Road right here. And you've got, or maybe that's Old Brunswick Road. And you've got this wetland system here, which is 20.84 acres. And so that under DEP regulation, under shoreline zoning, that has to be zoned as, everything around that has to be zoned as shoreline zoning.
George,
Yeah,
sorry, I'm not a land engineer. What does emergent mean and why is it so important that it's underlined?
okay. All I was trying to do is differentiate between forested and emergent.
Okay,
So both are wetlands in terms of the types of plants that are there, the types of soils, and the types of, and this condition of hydrology. So you got high water tables at or near the surface most of the time. And because of all that water, you have plants that either can tolerate that much moisture or they need it. And trees are somewhat limited in terms of their size because of the root systems not having a solid substrate. And so if it's forested, and these things change over time, as Juliet was pointing out, and the break off is if the preponderance of trees in the areas, and if you look at they do this based on aerial photography. So you can see this is open, and if you could take that color off, you'd see this field right here, this looks like that over here. And so this has the hydrology, it has the wetland plants, and what was the third? And the soils, wet soils. So this is emergent, right beside it, this is all trees, at least 18 feet or taller.
okay,
So that's
Okay, thank you.
forested. Okay? So
Great, thank you.
So we already dealt with the forested. Now we're moving on. All of this dark green is forested, like we were just discussing. Now we're moving to these much more limited areas where you have emergent wetlands. And I'm going to really zoom in on this and look at it from a number of different aspects. But starting 10 acres or more. So this one clearly shows up on the National Wetland Inventory as 22.84 acres. It's clearly in. When Mike Morse did his review for the town, he flagged this as one of the wetlands that had to be added under shoreline zoning. Now, if you take this little cluster over here, you got a 7-acre one, a 2.5 acre on this side, on the opposite side of the stream. So it gets a different classification. And then you've got 2 smaller 2-acre ones on the opposite side of the road. So Mike Morse, in his first analysis, he flagged this one over here, the 22 acres. When he did a follow-up analysis for the planning board, he added this one because he was debating whether DEP would put that in or not. So he put it in. It's all resource protection now, so it was a moot issue. But that's kind of the problem and the question of this. Do you add along with all contiguous wetlands? And from the last meeting, I struck that phrase out on this one. And the main reason is that with these 10-acre plus, there is an inevitable relationship to wetlands that surround them. So I'm going to walk you through that. Okay, so this is this area. We were just looking up here at these forested wetlands. Now we're down here looking at these emergent wetlands because there's more of them. And so that is this area right here. This on the right box is the National Wetlands Inventory. On the left is the map of the 2018 inventory of 10-acre plus wetlands. And these wetlands, if they're 10 acres or more, emergent wetland, non-forested, then this wetland itself has to be surrounded by shoreland zoning. And the town in 2019 actually updated the zoning map to add this to the zoning map. Now, it must be resource protection if it's forested wetland adjacent to it. It can be limited residential. And when we did this, the property owner hired a wetland consultant who contacted me to ensure that his plan to put houses along the road here in his open fields was not going to be stopped by this resource protection zoning. And so that he has the right, subject to the shoreline zoning limitations, to build a couple of houses along the road here. Okay, so criteria, policy options. Again, as with forested wetlands, just go by the National Wetlands Inventory of those that register as 10 acres or more. Second option is to add in the contiguous, going back to this corner right here where you got 4 separate ones, make that, they're all contiguous. That would be 10 acres and therefore be subject to this. And then again, you still have the option of relying upon the Army Corps and DEP wetland rules. And again, there may be another policy option that you could come up with or someone else. The current policy is to apply the DEP standards to the 10-acre plus wetlands, emergent wetlands, and within 250 feet, you have to have the shoreline zoning. That's the current policy.
I feel like whatever we select, it should be consistent with the last one, or whatever we endorse or move forward.
There is a slight difference, and that is that as we get into the next realm, when we start talking about what to do around the forested wetlands, I think should be looked at differently than the emergent wetlands in terms of you're required to do it under shoreline zoning. And the question becomes, what is the buffer around these open wetlands need to be? So there'll be generally that I think is a good analysis, but recognize there is potentially some fundamental differences between the forested wetlands and the emergent wetlands.
Okay.
We're going to get into that when we talk about the boundary around them. So let me actually, if you're okay, I'm going to continue with a little bit before you, and again, on any of these, if a policy, clear policy direction jumps out at you, like floodplains, we can do that. But other than that, don't feel like you need to.
I'm turned away from the door.
Are you turned away from the door, Zach?
Sorry, I thought I was still muted.
Welcome. Okay, so I'm going to drill down a little bit here and talk about the buffers around these emergent wetlands. So helping to understand what's going on with them, this is a USGS topo map. And so for this one right here that the DEP has said you must zone this as shoreline zoning around this 10-acre, it's actually, what was it, 20 acres, 18? It was 22, almost 23 acres. So around that 23 acres, the town is required to have a 250-foot buffer, which for these parts that are forested wetlands must be resource protection. The rest of it can be limited residential. So what you see here is there's a hill up here that divides this forested wetland. And then that drains down into this lower elevation that then drains off through a stream, which is depicted here, and currently has the resource protection zoning along that. But if you zoom in and look at that actual property, so this wetland right here in blue is this area right in here. And I'm going to zoom in again on that. So here is that wetland area depicted on the zoning map. And you can see that this is pretty much open marsh type wetland. And this is all cultivated agricultural fields here. You can see the demarcation. There's all kinds of lines here of crops. And so here's the farm access road that comes in. And I don't know if they're haying or what they're doing, but this is all under active agriculture. And so under DEP rules, because this is at least 10 acres, it's actually twice that size, you have to have shoreland zoning like Runaround Pond all the way around this thing. And for the portions that are forested wetland on what would be, I think, the west side, northwest side, around to about where this beaver bog comes up, or pond on the stream, that all has to be resource protection. And around this side, which is also forested wetland, all of this side is the limited residential. So the question becomes, you know, from a policy standpoint, should this be treated like Runaround Pond? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. And the question becomes, what are the inherent wildlife values that are there? Now, I keep going back to the 75 feet. And part of the reason for that is that under the shoreland zoning, when we brought in the those emergent wetlands under shoreland zoning, got a real backlash significantly from landowners who are now having their properties subject to that. Similar to the one that I just showed you, agricultural land. And the idea of putting a 250-foot buffer around their agricultural fields was just very hard to swallow and somewhat hard to support. So the state, in the state laws on shoreland zoning, has provided a provision that says, notwithstanding section 435, which is the shoreland zoning program, a municipality may limit to 75 feet rather than the 250-foot shoreland zone around a freshwater wetland that has been not been rated by the DIF&W as having moderate or high value for wild waterfowl and wading bird habitat, provided that the municipality applies the requirements of this article regarding streams as defined according to section 436A. So virtually anything that has NRPA, that would fall into that classification, to any outlet stream from those forested wetlands. So Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has identified within Durham 5 different wetland systems that have either moderate or high value waterfowl wading bird habitat. And these are the 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's one basis for saying, look, these are important wildlife habitats. And that's where, and the beginning with habitat data is going to support that. So the wetland systems that we were just looking at, they're not recognized by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife as having important habitat value. So the 75 feet could be applied to this wetland because it's not been identified. And so you'd end up with some protection around it, and the landowner would have to deal with that. The wetlands themselves are already regulated by Army Corps and DEP. And you already have at least 75 feet. You've now got 100 along these streams, so you'd meet this. So it's just an option for the town to consider. Mike Morris actually brought this one to my attention. So Along those lines, you'd have to have the 70 in order to get the reduction from 250 feet down to 75 feet around those wetlands. You'd have to have the streams that flow out of them 75 feet. You actually have that. This is the proposed revision to the resource protection zoning, and you'd still keep that along all of those streams. And what is really helpful in terms of this potentially very contentious policy discussion is that 4 out of the 5 moderate to high value are already in resource protection in the town of Durham. So it's not like you're putting something in that isn't already there now. And again, getting back to that principle of investment-based expectations. But if you're going to go in this direction, DEP would require the 250 feet around these 5 wetlands. And actually this number 1 up here, I looked at that in a little bit more detail. And the northern part of that was, at the time of the National Wetlands Inventory, 8.76 acres, which is less than 10. And the emergent wetland adjacent to it is 6.54. That's also less than 10. So DEP would not require shoreline zoning around this wetland. And that 250-foot buffer wouldn't come into play. So all the ones that are affected are currently in RP. So options for the buffers around those emergent wetlands would include the 250 feet around the moderate high value waterfowl wading bird habitat. You could go with 250 feet around all of the other emergent wetlands as well. Or you could take advantage of that special provision in the state law, which allows you to reduce the 250 feet down to 75 feet for anything that is not moderate or high value. Current policy is DEP standards with the 250 feet RP or LRD around them.
So George, for A, it would be 250 for those moderate values, but 75 for everything else?
Yes. And
Okay.
those ones are already
already
in
Yep.
resource protection.
Okay.
Yeah. So like for the one that I showed you right here, this
Yep.
would be, you'd go to 75 feet RP all the way around this along the border.
Okay,
Under-
great,
under
thank
that-
you.
Under that proposed policy. As opposed to what it is now with the 250 foot limited residential and 250 foot RP along this side.
Does anyone have any strong feelings about that, or next time we can pick it up right here, maybe?
There's a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you the dessert.
Not
And
much.
that is, last time I gave you number 8, which is land rated beginning with habitat as having 6+ multiple natural resource values. And some of the committee members really struggled with just accepting that because it's currently RP, that is a basis for not going beyond it. So I added the 9th, which is to say whether it's currently in RP or not. So what I did was I actually, when I was still tapping into GPCog before they shut me off, I got this iteration of this map. So you can see the correspondence between the dark green over here, and this also goes back to an earlier mention of the streams, the protection, potentially the expansion of those 75 feet in certain areas. And so that is reflected in the beginning with habitat. Most of these are 75 feet, but if a wetland extends beyond it, it goes with it. So some of these areas are wider, and also some of these are those beginning with habitat, or excuse me, inland fisheries and wildlife, moderate high value, like this area right here and this area right here. So the dark green, that's kind of reflected, at least 6+ is in this map. And so you can see the correspondence between the dark green over here and the dark green on this map, and see it's pretty close. Those are the areas that are 6+. And here's what I showed you last time, which is currently RP 6+. And here's all of it. And you can see it catches quite a bit. And most of those others are these stream corridors, which are going to be either floodplain or other wetland. So there's pretty good correspondence. And then I took it a step further, what I already had, and took, this was the proposed conceptual revision of the resource protection. And I took that overlay on the right and put it onto this with a transparency. And so you can see, as I said, here's the dark green along the floodplain corridors, pretty good correspondence. It's already covered. This circle right here, anybody guess what that is? You get a door prize if you can figure out what that is.
Yeah, I'm sure it's the occurrence of a rare species likely associated with the runaround pond, and that they do a big circle because they don't want the exact location known, because they don't want people going out and collecting either orchids or reptiles or amphibians, because some hunters will do that.
Ding, 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 ding. We have a winner.
Good job.
I work for Beginning with Habitat, so I should know our
I think it's
location. So
I think it's Blanding turtle.
Oh, interesting. Well, there's plenty of turtles that run around ponds, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and so what you see here is there is a radius back on the Beginning with Habitat map, a complete radius. And I'm not sure what whether it's a mile or whatever it is. Some of that's already developed. You can see over here. And so a lot of it isn't. But it's all, much of that, if not most of it, is either wetland or ponds, stream buffers. So that circle, again, does not include the already developed lands and open agricultural fields, which is probably not real good habitat for them. And so when you overlay it, it's pretty close, Juliet.
Yeah, it is, which makes great sense, right? It makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. Yep.
Yeah, so I think most of it would be covered, except for that turtle habitat. But
Yeah.
again, if you go in that direction of saying, look, we're going to follow Beginning with Habitat and fully implement it as part of this, then the comprehensive plan itself says consider resource protection or mandatory clustering. So that if these areas, they were allowed a certain number of 2-acre lots, they could still do those 2-acre lots, but they'd have to cluster the development to preserve as much open space as possible. And as part of that design process, you look at, are there reptile migration routes? And those should be in that common open space. You could actually have a wildlife biologist required to do that analysis for subdivision. There was one here in Falmouth when the vernal pool regulations were first coming in, and a subdivision had to build a bridge to allow the amphibians to migrate across the road underground. Culvert, a flat culvert. It was pretty interesting to see the analysis.
By
Yeah,
the
like
way,
a,
that time's coming right up. That time's
a-
coming up.
Yeah, like a mini Banff, right? That crossing in Canada for the
Oh,
wild.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, that's the whole menu. So I'm going to go back to the list, complete
And then
list.
what's the next step? Where do we go from here once we've gone through all the decision making?
Well,
I think,
go ahead.
correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the plan here for George to kind of to lay it all out for us, and then our next meeting would be for us to kind of discuss these recommendations and anything we might want to change or include, and then start the real big process after that.
That's my understanding too.
Mhm.
And ideally, if this is going to go forward, if you folks could come on board and be the advocates for this part of it, there's no constituency in town more appropriately targeted to deal with this stuff and try to come up with some reasonable policies. And then it'll go back to the planning board for consideration for amendments. And so at some point, having, as Juliet's been pushing since I've been here, get the planning board and the conservation committee together. You folks will have had all of this background and hopefully will have good understanding of it and some hopefully consensus on what direction the town should go in on these different. You're probably going to get some pushback from the planning board perspective, working with landowners and developers who come in and, you know, hammer them all the time to not restrict their property rights. So there needs to be a balancing act here between private property rights and public interests. And many, many communities have found that proper balance and come up with workable. And part of this is not just to pacify the developers and landowners, is to say, look, if you want public support for these programs, you've got to get people on board. And if the people are not feeling like this is being done fairly and equitably and based on good data, the political opposition to any environmental regulations that you try to pursue gets really intense.
Yeah, I think if I can speak to the group and just say that we would definitely support, you know, this and help talk about it and be advocates for whatever the decision is, right? Everyone?
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely, Juliet.
Yeah, okay.
It's like anyone,
Hello?
anyone.
We're
Wait,
talking about the
we
planning
talked
board.
about that.
Bueller. Yeah, so I think we just need to digest our major Thanksgiving dinner and
So as with last week, I'll print this out as a PDF and send it out to you. And if you'd like me to come back after you've had time to chew on it for a while and discuss it among yourselves, be happy to come back again and see if you have some direction.
If we come up with questions, George, can we just, is it possible for us just to shoot you a quick email if there's anything really
Absolutely.
fast? Yeah, okay, very cool.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yep. Oh, yeah, awesome.
Also, I was wondering, I don't know if Ruth's still here, but if George is going to send us an email, it's right in the middle of the transition. You
Mhm.
better transfer that to, I don't know if it's okay to put it on your personal email for now or somewhere else, just so that you have it, because I think maybe it'll disappear.
I think our new emails are working. I was able to get into mine.
Oh, maybe it already did it
The prompt
and I
one.
didn't even, it was so seamless that I didn't even notice. Except I think I have old emails on there and I think they were supposed to disappear.
April 9th, I believe.
Oh my God,
is
my
the
email works.
turnover.
Ah,
Congrats,
email
Zach.
works. That's awesome. All right, sorry, that made me happy. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, I think we got to figure out the next step for, I probably for Jess, but at least for myself, about getting a Durham email, because I never had one at all. So yeah.
We can, yep, we can figure that out.
yep.
So it looks like April 22nd is the, like, would be our typical fourth Thursday of the month. Do we want George to come or do we want to digest and discuss?
I say let's digest and discuss. And it sounds like George is open to us reaching out if we have any questions or we need, further clarifications on anything. I think there's been a lot to look at today. I've been just sitting here like just watching this, and it sounds like we have a lot we'll need to hash out because I think it was Samantha mentioned, having, a somewhat consistent strategy to approach this would probably be advisable to help us kind of hammer out all the work that needs to be done over all these lots, essentially. Let's do that.
Great. So 22nd, we'll set that up. Thank you again, George, for your time.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
very
so
This was
welcome.
a
much.
delicious feast. Thank you.
Bon
I really hope you
appetit.
guys couldn't
And
hear me.
just we have to
eating this salad.
confirm, none of this is a April Fool's joke or anything. This is all the real deal.
Eh.
All right, so next meeting, the 22nd at 6:30, right?
Yep.
6:30.
See you
Great.
then.
All
Thanks,
right.
Sounds good,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank
Nice.
you.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
So,
Bye.
Cheers.
Night.